Thank you all for coming to the afternoon session on translation, an important topic having to do with Tibetan Buddhism in the West. I'll just make one brief remark. I don't want to take very much time out of our speaker's time, but just to say that when I first started studying Buddhism, the situation was very different than it is now. There were very few works that were available in translation. And now, obviously, there's a great deal more, and I think within one more generation from now, we will find that the situation will be yet again very different from what it is now. And maybe closer to what it was at the end of the Tibetan imperial period, when a large body of Indian material, this time translated mostly from Tibetan, although from Sanskrit sources as well, are going to be available for the study of Buddhism. So things are changing, and they're changing very, very rapidly. And many of the people that are here that will be speaking today are some of the major agents of such change in the last decades. His Holiness said something very interesting today, that we should put emphasis on the trunk and not put so much emphasis on the branches. Meaning that our emphasis really should be on the source of the Buddhist tradition rather than on its various manifestations, especially in Tibet in terms of the distinct lineages. And yet, I think there's a case to also be made for the fact that it's only on the various branches that we find flowers. So I think some of the works that have been translated in the last decades have been precisely those flowers that exist from those branches, the great works that are found in the Tibetan literary tradition, and that many people who are up on the stage have been pivotal in bringing to the Western world. That isn't to say that going back to the original Indian sources is not important. In fact, there are major undertakings right now to translate the entire Kanjur, the scriptural portion of the canon, of the Tibetan Buddhist canon, and eventually the Tengyur, the commentarial portion as well. But that doesn't mean that we can't also turn our attention to the rich Tibetan literary tradition. And we have an incredible panel of speakers today, two major speakers, and then a number of different panelists who have dedicated their lives to the task of translation in one way or another. I think what we'll do is have the two keynote speakers present their talks first, and then I'll open it up to the panelists, and then we'll have some general discussion, and hopefully there'll be time for questions from the audience as well. So our two main speakers hardly need introduction. Professor Jeffrey Hopkins is Professor Emeritus from the University of Virginia. He in fact founded the program in Tibetan and Buddhist studies at the University of Virginia, where he taught for some 30-odd years, and is the author, translator of numerous works that themselves have been translated into many different languages. I think actually on this stage also there are several people who are currently or have at one point or another translated for His Holiness, not only into English but also into Spanish. And Jeffrey has been one of those translators. So Jeffrey, why don't you begin?
So, after almost dying in 1991, appropriate to after talking about having to save all parts of my body, this loosened my tongue somewhat, as does my advancing age. And there's, ever since then, I've found less and less point in saving something for later. I've understood that later is now. Jung said that almost all theory is subjective confession. So whether one is a so-called scientist or a Buddhist scientist, however, whatever way we're framing things, it's whether we're claiming to be objective or whatever, it's really subjective confession. Ronald Reagan, of all people, had the insight that one should not identify with one's role. Which is really smart. George Clooney said something like, don't box yourself in by calling yourself or your method this or that. But I've been called on myself today to call my method this or that. And as I said, I'm willing to loosen my tongue a little bit and say this or that. But whenever you say I'm this or that, or I do it this way or that way, if you have any capacity to watch what you do, you soon find out you don't do it this way or that way. And if I say I do things this way or that way, please say, well, then why the hell did you do it this other way? We don't start from a blank slate. My own background, I have to say, I had a childhood determination somewhere between probably the age 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there, to engage in translation. I thought it was necessary to translate my own background for them. I have a bunch of notes here. I'm not reading from a prepared script, but it jumps here and there. One of my own teachers in Mexico City, I was asked to talk about my teachers. I listed out some 21 important ones. One of them said, put Swaraswati or Saraswati on your tongue. Imagine Manjushri in your throat. Repeat Om Arabhadanati, as another teacher said, endlessly. D, endlessly. He was telling a young Kalmyk boy, endlessly. I was, listening in the next room. And that other teacher said, and make sure to teach. Otherwise, no one will understand what you've translated. No one can tell others, I think, how to translate. I often say, I can tell you maybe something about how I translate, but the natural creative urge is such that once somebody's done it this way, the next person will say, well, but there's this other way that it ought to be done. So I'm going to say a little bit today about how I have done things, not in hopes that you will do it that way, or that somebody you know will do it that way, but just to say how I've done it. And to pass along a few tips and tricks. Manjushri in the throat. One of my techniques that I've used to great extent is brackets, inserting a lot of brackets into my translations. And I myself, when I read my translations, enjoy those brackets a lot because I find I wouldn't understand the translation unless those bracketed remarks were there. And I put the material in brackets because it's added. It's added from somewhere. And I tend to indicate where it was added from. I have noticed that almost no one uses brackets anymore. It's as if because I've done that, people after me have decided we're not going to do it that way. Which I find amusing because I recognize the creative urge is such that once somebody's done it this way, the next people are going to do it some other way. I have been particularly amused due to the fact that it was Trubetsky's style to insert a great deal into a translation without brackets that led me to put in brackets, that nowadays people are inserting again some material without brackets that isn't justified by the material that's there. And some of my own students and so forth, which of course they're no longer my students. Geshe Wangyal one day did a prophecy with the Lamrim. This was just, who are these people who are sitting around the lunch table going to be in the future? And, he turned a page, put his finger down, and mine was on Samba, bridge. Well, that's what I am. I'm a bridge. Nobody stops and stays with me. Somebody said somewhere, if he's such a great guy, why is no one still with him? In other words, why is he alone now? Hey, I'm a bridge. Anyway, the old, word translation, meaning translation, straight translation, backwards translation. It's a great source. Among those, I prefer word translation. As Sidney Pyburn of Snow Lion said early on, couldn't you do something that's a little bit less wooden? And after a couple years, I said to him, I'm trying to work on something a little bit less wooden. And he said, oh, no, leave it just as it is. Meaning, it builds up its own culture, its own environment, and we can count on you. So I've pretty much left it alone. I prefer simple English as opposed to, if there's a term that's got 6 syllables and one that's got 4, or even better, 2, I prefer 2 syllables. Now that may amaze you. I'll prefer the 2 or 4 over 6 any day. I'll prefer the Anglo-Saxon term, therefore I learned Anglo-Saxon in my senior year in college. I don't know it anymore. But it's, it's 1-syllable words, 2-syllable words. Skeleton is banhus, bone house. That was Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon is not Chaucer. Chaucer's later on. So, the simple words we have, bone and things like that, that's Anglo-Saxon. It's got nothing to do with my heritage, which is, I suppose, Anglo-Saxon. I don't care about that at all. I did 4.5 years of Latin, so I suppose I should have some more affection for the Latinese translations, translation terms, but I don't. Those are my choices. My own mentor at the University of Wisconsin was Richard Robinson, and near the end of his life, his editor was Fred Strang, and Fred Strang said, no sentence over 3 lines. So Richard passed this on to me. And so I worked on the basis for decades of no sentence over 3 lines. And then, of course, when you're working on that, you say, well, what about do 2 lines? What about do 1 line? Try to shorten it, shorten it, shorten it. And then maybe the last 10 years, I've gone to, hey, get rid of that idea. If you can do it clearly, mirror the Tibetan. And if it goes on for 2 pages, so what? If it's clear. So now, over the last 15 years or so, there are, I'll use M dashes, bullets, semicolons, as long as it remains coherent. You can quarrel with me about it. What do you mean coherent? I do avoid assiduously what I would call phony academic language. I have been an academic. I was taught at the University of Virginia, I think it was, for 32 years. And I'm used to academics choosing Latin-esque, Greek, you name it, whatever words for even simple things. One of my colleagues, you have to choose something Latin-esque in order, I don't know why, I have my own theory. You can't say unique. One of my colleagues, he couldn't say unique, he had to say unum. That's an unum. My God, give me a break. My own myth that I operate in is that medicine is the worst, right? They've got this mumbo jumbo. They can't say nose, they can't say throat, they can't say tongue, they can't say heart, they can't say kidneys, they can't use any of those words. Where does this come from? Why did they do this? The myth that I live in is that they looked at those priests, and the priests were doing a whole lot of mumbo jumbo, and the congregations were all going, wow, wow, and giving them money and believing in them. And so the people this is all the myth that I live in. I have no backing for this. And the same in law. They wanted the same prestige that the priests had. So they used Latin and Greek and so forth. And then, you go on centuries and centuries, and then you get people in religious studies. And they look at the people in medicine and in law. And they say, oh, look at all that mumbo jumbo. And we can't talk about liberation. We have to talk about soteriology. We can't talk about interpretation. We have to talk about hermeneutics. That way, no one will know but us what we're talking about. And even some of us won't know what we're talking about. It'll all be an unum. And some people like Hopkins won't even be able to pronounce it. So, given that this is my background, I always find it amusing when I'd go to the private office and Denzin Geshe would call me, oh, here's the word man. Meaning my words were too big for him. Oh my God, I didn't know what to do. Because of course, if you're translating Buddhist philosophy, you want a different word for every term. You've got to come up with something, and you've got to be consistent. Give me a break, Tenzin Geshe. And His Holiness also. It's like, looking at me. What's wrong with you? Now make it simple. You know, it's like, and I'm thinking, do you want me to just use the word real all the time? You know, you got 10, 15, 20 words that have to be translated as real. Anyways, I'm just passing along my frustrations. So it's very amusing very helpful to work in a different genre. One of these genres, the more popular books, in which, believe it or not, it's written right in the contract of the Simon & Schuster Atria books that I've been doing in the last 10 or 12 years for His Holiness, that technical meanings will be retained. And the last choices on editing will be in our hands, not in the hands of some editor. And they're saying, oh, sure. Because actually they know that I'm quite, that I'm somebody that people can work with. So now here you're working in a different genre, and so you can use multiple translation terms for one term, something like nyomon, klesha, which generally speaking I use afflictive emotions. And so for this talk today, I went through that series of 5 books, and I found that I used these terms: afflictive emotions, destructive emotions, counterproductive emotions, self-defeating emotions, troublesome emotions, twisted emotions, warped emotions, harmful emotions, exaggerated emotions, distressing emotions, self-destructive emotions, unfavorable emotions, negative emotions, painful emotions, poisonous emotions, hurtful emotions. See, I'm even in Dylan Thomas mode. Problematic emotions, troubling emotions, bad emotions. They've conquered me in my old age. I whimper, simper, old man that I am, dying of age. So it's quite a delight for somebody who started out as a writer to have the lid lifted off of, this constriction that I've put myself in order to be consistent and to make it so that people can follow over a body of work what is being talked about. And nobody so far has come to me and said, what is the difference between problematic emotions and troubling emotions? But that day will come. So one thing that's helpful for that type of writing is to get a world-class editor. That's just amusing. I'm teasing. At this late age, I've been lucky to have Stephen Hawking's editor from A Short History of Time. And when you think about that title, who made up that title? A Short History of Time. A very good editor. He's never, he did work just lately on a subtitle for a book for His Holiness. Then I want to say a little bit about interpreting. Pretend that it's easy. One of my friends said one day at the lectures that his seminar that His Holiness gave at Harvard, she said, I can see how hard it is for you. We really appreciate what you're doing. And I thought, oh my, that's not the impression that I should give. So from then on, I pretended it was very easy. I think it's good to pronounce Tibetan names like they are in Tibetan, not like they've come to be pronounced the way non-Tibetans do. Like, people say Tsongkhapa, But of course, I think we should just say Tsongkhapa, as best we can. But then we're left with words like tulku, are we going to say tulku? I'm supposed to say what? In tashi. But at least we don't have to say finso thunden. My choice, when I served as interpreter for His Holiness, which, is faded into the night as if it never was at this point, was to be diaphanous, because you had a dynamic person that you were standing next to, and there was absolutely no need to be going like this and making a big deal out of yourself. But there are persons who even, in translating for His Holiness, do this, or for other lamas. But there are some lamas who don't even look at the audience. And I found that if then I'm going, then the audience is going, so then, actor that I am, I'd have to, do a little bit of this without, going too far. And speak right into the hearts of the audience. Speak into the back row. Speak right into the heart. That way you'll not let your voice drop off at the end of the sentence. Isn't that terrible when that happens? When anyone speaks? And they let their mind... Translator or... Whether you're translating or not, right? Anyone who's speaking in public. Be prepared for excessive praise and to be dumped on for getting in the way, right? As interpreter. Why don't you translate what the Lama says? And I never had this problem. I was always taken care of extremely well. But let's face it, there are a lot of people who translate at centers and so forth who are not taken care of well. The refugee Lama and the people who work for the Lama take every cent pretty much that's offered on the table into their own pockets. And the translator is not taken care of very well. We have to face this problem. And I think the translator, herself or himself, should blame herself or himself. Do a contract beforehand. Do the contract. And in general, my time is up. And to all a good night.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey. So our next speaker, I'll try not to talk off the side of it, is Geshe Thupten Jinpa. And in one of the morning panels, it was mentioned that there are very few people who hold both the highest degree that's offered in the Tibetan monastic academies and also the highest degree that's offered in the Western Academy, but Thupten Jinpa is one of these individuals. He holds a Geshe degree from Chartse College of Ganden Monastery and a PhD from Cambridge University, and is presently, I think, on the faculty of McGill University. and is also the founder of the Institute of Tibetan Classics, and has himself published, translated several of the works in the Library of Tibetan Classics, which is quickly becoming one of the most important collections of Tibetan translations available in English. So Geshe Thupten Jimal.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure for me to be part of this and share the platform with some of my colleagues, including my mentor and predecessor, who served His Holiness for a long time, Professor Hopkins. When the organizers approached me to see if I would be willing to, be part of this conversation, I said, I might be a bit tired after the day's over, but they said, no, it's not going to be a big event, it's just more of a conversation, and Jeffrey is going to be the other speaker. I said, okay, in that case. So, so it's a real joy. What I would like to say, and in fact, I'm looking more forward to the conversations that will follow. So I haven't really done much preparation, partly because I was very busy before coming here. And I'm also slightly tired as well because of the whole long day. Now, as many of you will know, the early Tibetans coined the term Lotsawa, eyes of the world, to refer to the Tibetan translators. And I think it's very telling, because that the word that was coined to refer to the translators was a form of showing their gratitude and recognition of the tremendous role the translators played in bringing Dharma from India to Tibet. And in some sense, these early Tibetan translators were truly the eyes of the world so far as Tibet was concerned, because it was, nothing like the translation of the Dharma into Tibetan language has ever happened in the whole history of Tibet that has had such far-reaching impact and transformation on the people, on the land, on the culture, on the language, and everything. So, and if you look back in the history, although it is not generally widely acknowledged, but you can see parallel transformations as a result of large-scale translations elsewhere in the world, from the translations of the Hebrew Bible before the Common Era into Latin, and subsequently the translations of many of the Latin texts into a Greek text and Latin text into Arabic. For example, it was thanks to the Arabic translations of the Aristotle's works that great thinkers like Thomas Aquinas was able to actually understand and study Aristotle. So there was that translation of quite a lot of text into Arabic during the Baghdad Caliphate. Then later on in the English language, you can see the tremendous impact that the creation of the King James Version of the Bible had on the language, on the culture. So if you look at the history of the world, one could argue that every time there has been a major impact and transformation on a particular intellectual and spiritual tradition, it has always coincided with certain epochs of translation. And what we see today in the contemporary world is a movement of similar magnitude, I would argue. The translations of the Buddhist texts, particularly beginning with the Pali text societies, large-scale movement, and I'm a great admirer of the Pali Text Society, history of the development of Pali Text Society. Now today, in the aftermath of the Tibetan people's tragedy, we are beginning to see a similar kind of translation epoch now coming from the Tibetan sources into contemporary languages such as English. So we might be, and it may seem presumptuous, partly because my own professional work, a large part of it involves translation. So it may seem presumptuous, but I would argue that what we are seeing and witnessing today is a similar kind of epoch. And the impact of this, in this activity that we are all engaged in, is going to be a long-lasting, and hopefully it will be a humanizing influence on the contemporary world culture. So I just wanted to share that partly to encourage ourselves, because, and in my own personal case, you know, I sort of stumbled into translation. You know, translation when I was growing up as a kid, even as a monastic scholar in South India, translation was never in the radar. I just happened to stumble into this. My own kind of, you know, relationship with English language began with my love of the language, and in fact, you know, I left school after grade 4. So, you know, my command of English was that of a typical Tibetan child at, you know, at grade 5. So, but fortunately, it was in Dharamsala in the early 70s. It was at the right time. There were plenty of hippies around, you know, so I was a member of a monastery which was a ritual monastery. There was no academic training, so during the daytime, all the senior monks would go and do pujas in the family homes, and there were 6 of us kids who were left alone with 1 or 2 caretakers and a cook. So we, you know, once we had done our daily portions of memorizations of the ritual text which we were given, and I always used to do 2 or 3 days memorization ahead, just in case that I just end up forgetting doing it. So I always had 2 to 3 days of supply of memorization portion. So that meant I had a huge amount of time during the daytime, and fortunately, today this place is where the Tushita Center is. We used to call it Naroji Cottage. There was a whole group of hippies there, and I started, you know, first I began rummaging through the garbage that there was some nice flashy, you know, broken flashlights and broken umbrellas, which, you know, some of us, the kids, used to collect. But then later, I became friends with some of them. And that was how my love of English language began. And so in the monastery in South India, when I was studying for my Geshe course, for me, English was the language of leisure. You know, I loved novels, and particularly the Victorian ones. And but of course, you know, life never unfolds in the way in which you plan. And in 1985, accidentally, I was stumbled upon in Dharamsala, where I was actually for some other purpose, but it so happened that His Holiness was giving a teaching, and then to cut a long story short, one thing led to another. I ended up being asked to translate at the teaching. Since then, once His Holiness personally asked me if I was willing to make myself available to travel with him, of course for a Tibetan, and particularly for a young monk, this was a tremendous honor and a privilege. I remember being in tears when he personally said that. So then it kind of placed upon me a much greater responsibility now to take English language seriously, my command of the language, and also to try to deepen my understanding of the language so that I'll be able to serve His Holiness in a more effective manner. So that's how my translation life story began. So what I'm going to say now more specifically about the nature of the work, translation, is going to be, as my colleague Jeffrey said, you know, it's going to be more autobiographical. It's not so much in the normative sense of this is how translation should be done, but more in the sense of this is how I've come to understand what exactly is the enterprise that we call translation. So, you know, the question there, like, what exactly is translation, and what is the relationship of the translator to the original text? He's clearly not the author, but at the same time, this is the creation of the translator. And then what is the relationship between the author and the translator? So these are, you know, not easy questions. And, you know, I remember as a young monk debating in the courtyard of Gandanishatse, one of the trick questions I've had, you know, this was a first-year Pramanavartika is a logical text, Dharmakirti's text on epistemology. One of the trick questions I used to have is, to my fellow students, is the Tibetan version of Pramanavartika, which is this original Sanskrit text, Pramanavartika? And if so, was it written by Dharmakirti? If so, did Dharmakirti know Tibetan? So, you start immediately, it raises questions about the process. So these are important questions, and now, so also there is the basic question, what exactly is the translation? And what am I doing when I'm translating, say, a text by Tsongkhapa? And how can one possibly create a translation of a text, say, by Tsongkhapa, which is into English, which is not only separated, the translation is not only separated from that original text by language, culture, but also by time and societal context as well. So, and then here, looking back, I then started digging into Tibetan own resources, and I noticed that, of course, in many cases, like many other human activities, often practice precedes the theorizing. So the same thing as Tibetan translations of the early scriptures. The early translators never really asked questions what exactly they were doing. But then by the time, beginning of the 9th century, when the influential lexicon, bilingual lexicon called Mahayupati or Tajrupampanipa was created, in the preamble, it is quite impressive that there was a very conscious deliberations on what kind of approaches a translator should take. Whether the translator should attempt to translate every single word from the Indian source into Tibetan, or whether some of the terms should be left in the original Sanskrit, and if so, should they be Tibetanized? So there were, and there was a lot of emphasis placed on making the finished product readable, understandable, accessible to the Tibetan. So that was quite for me, someone having worked in translation for quite a while, to discover those kind of concerns, even as early as early 9th century, was quite kind of revelation. Then later on, I also found much more extensive, thinking about translation in Sakya Pandita's text. Perhaps one could argue that he is probably the only person in the entire history of Tibetan thought who has given so much thought on the nature of translation. Sapen goes to great lengths in his Gateway for the Learned about the relationship between translation and the original and the role of the translator. And so and he even goes to quite a lengthy critique of some of the early Tibetan translators. For example, like Sarasvati is translated into Tibetan as Yangjen Lhamo, but he demonstrates that this was a misreading of Swati as Sati, and instead of Sarasvati, it was read as Sarasati. And his point was not to say that we should change this, but his point was to remind the Tibetan readers that if you recognize a certain errors that was made in a particular translation, and if it has already become an established convention, the recognition of that error is important, because you're then not going to read, create commentaries that will try to give etymological gloss on the terms that you have chosen, which has no basis in the Sanskrit. So one of the examples he gives is the term Yeshe, and the Tibetan term is composed of 2 syllables, Ye and She, whereas the Sanskrit is just Yang. And Sapen points out, again, the problem here is that then the Tibetan commentators come up with a kind of an etymological explanation of the word Ye and She, which has no basis in the original. So Sapen goes to great lengths. And another point that Sapen raises, which is very important, is to really remind us some of the fundamental differences in the syntactic structure of the original Sanskrit and the Tibetan, and how in translating between the two, the translator has greater responsibilities to preserve and maintain the Tibetan syntactic structure than replicate the Sanskrit syntactic structure, because the word is being produced in Tibetan, not in Sanskrit, and the reader is going to be reading in Tibetan, not in Sanskrit. One of the examples he gives is, and this is not in the Gateway, but from some other text, he points out that many of the sentences in Tibetan translations where the case is used in the instrumental sense, with a sa, in the original Sanskrit, it's in the fifth case, ablative case. So Sapen goes to great length to really point out these distinctions. So in the end, if you look at these kind of discussions, one of the key problems that Sapen and others are trying to grapple with is really this fundamental question of, how do you balance between the two poles, both of which needs to be respected. One is the faithfulness to the original on the one hand. The other is the need for making the text accessible and readable and understandable to the host reader. So now, and then in fact the challenge is a bit more complex, because there needs to be a balance, not just between these two, but actually among others. For example, like, how do you maintain a balance between kind of extreme literalism on the one side and kind of, free kind of, appropriation on the other, which has no real connection to the original. But then if you're too close to the literal approach, then in some sense you are violating the norms of the language into which you are translating. So these are challenges, and then in some cases, how do you balance between the attention that needs to be paid to the content of the particular sentence and the context of that sentence? So translation is quite a complex process. And so here, those who are interested in these kind of questions, and many of you may not be, but I am, because I'm trained in philosophy, and for me, critical self-reflection is a very engaging activity. I find it a very engaging activity. There is recently a book came out by this very famous woman translator from Spanish into English, Edith Grossman. She just recently produced a new translation of Don Quixote. And she wrote a book called Why Translation Matters. And I would urge those who are interested in this topic to read it. And it's actually quite an impressive, she's not a theoretician. She's writing it from a practitioner's point of view. But she has some very interesting things to say about the practice of translation. And I'll just read one or two, how I'm doing with time.
5 minutes.
5 minutes,
Yeah.
okay. Now, for example, she says, I quote here, "A translator's fidelity is not to the lexical pairing, but to context, the implications and the echoes of the first author's tone, intention, and level of discourse. Good translations are good because they are faithful to this contextual significance. Translators translate content." And then she goes on to say, one of the things that she mentions there is she says that once quite a famous translator from from the translator of Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, someone called Gregory Rabassa was asked by an interviewer, and I read from Grossman again. She writes, "Some time ago, while Gregory Rabassa was translating Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, he was asked by an exceptionally unintelligent interviewer whether he knew enough Spanish to translate the novel. Rabassa's glorious response was that this was certainly the wrong question. The real question, he said, was whether he knew enough English to do justice to that extraordinary book, because it was being translated into English. So in an ideal world, I am the wrong kind of person to translate because English is not my native language. And to be able to translate well into English, you really need to have a very high degree of command of the language into which you are translating. So I think this is important. Another thing that she cites, which I find very helpful, and she says that, again I quote from Grossman, she says, Ralph Mannheim, the great translator from German, so famously said, translators are like actors who speak the lines as the author would if the author could speak English. So, this is the kind of, challenge that the translator possesses when he's or she goes about, engaging in that enterprise. Now, the question is, what exactly is translation? Now here, some people have argued, for example, in this very influential book, it's a fairly old book now, by George Steiner called After Babel. He argues that in some sense, what is happening in the process of translating from one language to another language is an kind of an instance of, a kind of a special instance of what actually happens in the context of two people communicating between each other within one language. So it's more of a question of signification, conveying the significance of words and context and sentences. So in other words, translation is kind of an interpretive performance where you are carrying a set of meaning from one set of language and discourse into another set. So I think these are, helpful kind of, suggestions. Now, in my own case, what I have found personally is that it's helpful to have multiplicity of approaches depending upon the genre of text that you're working on. And depending upon the text, I think we need to shift the balance between literalism on the one hand and more accessibility and fluidity of the language on the other, lucidity of the language on the other. Now, I would argue that if you are translating technical tantric texts, then because many of the tantric texts, especially the root text, have terms that must allow multiple levels of reading. In these kind of situations, if you stray too far from the literal meaning of the text, you then lock out all the other possibilities of interpretation, because by doing an interpretive translation, by that very act, you rule out the space for other interpretations. So in those kind of situations, we need a much more literal approach, particularly to the technical terms. Now, on the other hand, if I'm translating poetry, then the kind of balance should shift more on the other direction, because poetry's primary role is to evoke. It is supposed to conjure and evoke within the reader an aesthetic sense. So I think then there one needs to use the full force of the devices that you find in the host language, in other words, English, and also try to make sure that you don't restrict yourself by the syntax of the original text. I can give you a simple example. There is this beautiful poem by the first Dalai Lama, which talks about remembering Tsongkhapa. And, it goes like this: over the, peaks of white snow mountains in the east, rises high, massive clouds that reaching up to the sky. Now, in the original, it says from Shakharikabutsemone, which is an ablative case. Now, imagine trying from, then in the second line, there is no verb. As if reaching for the sky. So in these kind of cases, replication of that syntax not only doesn't matter, but in fact it is counterproductive. It kind of restricts you from conveying the full beauty and the ecstatic experience of the poetry. So when you're doing poetry, but then when you have, if I'm working on philosophical, like the poetry, for example, I just a couple of years ago finished the Book of Gadam and the Father Teachings. A large chunk of that text is in poetry. Now, in doing poetry, then I had to do a lot of reading in English, and particularly reading of poetry in English in translations, such as Dante's, Paradise, and translations of Rilke's poems, translations of Tagore's poems into English, because these are people who have done translations from another language into English. So to be able to see what you can do, and then if I'm translating a philosophical text, then the analytic rigor and the sophistication of the argument and the strands in the arguments are very important. So those need to be, so what I've found is not to have a dogmatic approach, but more of a kind of a context-based approach, so that whatever genre of text that I'm working on, I'm able to work, use a particular style of translation for that is relevant to that text. So these are the kind of things that I've personally tried to do in my own work, and especially if it is poetry, then I try to read the final translation aloud. And especially those, I worked on much earlier, before the Library of the Tibetan Classics, Library of Tibetan Classics began. I worked on a book with a friend of mine called Songs of Spiritual Experience, which is a collection, anthology of Tibetan poems. I found out very helpful that if I can read the poems aloud in English. And also one of the things about the Tibetan poetry is that unless it is a translation from Sanskrit sources, Tibetan poetry tends to use kind of syllable-based, actually a stress-based syllable numbers. And depending upon whether it is a standard prayer text or hymns, and if it is, for example, an experiential song being written by a meditator, then often they would use a rhythm that in some ways simulates the folk song, the tune of the Tibetan folk song. So therefore, and they tend to go in the stress on which, on the syllable number on which the stress falls differs between different types of poetry. So I think these are the kind of things I just wanted to share with those there are a number of people who are here actually doing active translations, so that just wanted to share these, my own observations, so that when you sit down working on a text, I think it is important to first of all appreciate what genre of that to which the text belongs to, and then to reflect upon what is the best approach to use it, and in the end to really strive to ensure that the final product is a text which can stand on its own in English, so that when an English reader reads it, has a kind of an ability to speak for the reader. So I just wanted to share this. Thank you.
Thank you, Geshe. So I think now we will, I'll give a few minutes to each of the panel members if they'd like to make any comments either on the two keynote addresses that we just heard, or else on any topic related to the question of translating the Dharma. And we have a fantastic group of panelists. Gerardo Abboud is the president of the Dongyuling Buddhist Center in Argentina, and he is also His Holiness's chief translator into Spanish. Professor Sarah Harding is on the faculty of Naropa University and an accomplished translator of several works. And the most recent of one is the Machik, or your latest?
The latest was the Treasury of Knowledge.
The Treasury of Knowledge, which is itself a tremendous accomplishment, this multi-volume translation of the Geshe Dadul, this fantastic encyclopedic work. And Tim McNeill is the editor-in-chief of Wisdom Publications, which is one of the major publishing houses publishing Buddhist material, and he's here also in his capacity as representative of the FPMT, of the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, and finally Geshe Dadul Namgyal, who was on the faculty of, was himself a translator for His Holiness on the faculty of the Central University for Tibetan Studies in Sarnath, and I think presently based in Atlanta. Is that right, Geshe-la? Yes. Yes. So, a fabulous panel. So why don't we just simply go down the line, and I'll give each of you a few minutes if you want to say anything, either in general or about the talks. So, Gerardo.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organization for having invited me to share this prestigious panel. I'm an interpreter. If we have to define interpreting and translating, I have done some books, but they have been mostly compilations of translations or interpretations that I've done of oral teachings. Although I have done a lot of translation of text, but they never got through to printing yet, and hopefully at some time they will. And that is how I think I have a little bit of experience to share, maybe, about the difficulties that I find in both cases. Interpreting, in some sense, has, of course, other types of challenges. The challenge of immediacy, because there is no time. You have to immediately convey whatever the teacher has said. That means to say that your vocabulary has to be very fast and very accurate. But at the same time, there is more leeway, because you don't need to be, you convey the meaning. It's mostly like a meaning translation. And as far as possible to keep to the words also. But you may say 2 or 3 words to translate one word that the teacher has said, something that you cannot possibly put in written form, because otherwise it becomes impossible to read. So it has also another challenge of not boring the people who are listening to your translation. And at the same time, not becoming too a kind of distinctive personality of your own as a translator or as an interpreter, because the teacher is the most important person. Challenges also of remembering everything that the teacher has said. And if you don't remember all of it, then you can put it into the next installment. That sometimes happens. What you forgot, then somehow you fit it into the next installment. So there are certain challenges, of course, in interpreting, but at the same time, there is more flexibility in some way. It's not going to be written and definite in some way, and it can always be improved. If from that interpretation you are making a book, then you can always go back to the source and go word by word and have it done more accurately. Now, written translation, what I find is basically, well, it has to do with, I think, how our languages have developed, probably. I might be wrong, of course. But in our Western cultures, whether English or Spanish or whatever, we've always developed our cultures and, of course, languages which are an outcome of that culture on the basis of the way we perceive reality and the way we grow and we live our reality. And it's always been one reality. Unlike Tibetans and other Asian cultures, that they have another basis of how to face life, which is 2 realities. There is the absolute reality and the conventional reality. So because of that, I think that our languages have become extremely precise, but at the same time quite frozen. So it's like in Spanish or to a lesser extent in English, then words, they do have, we need to be extremely precise somehow when we use the language, because that reflects also our respect, our complete devotion to the relative reality that we live. That is the only reality. Whereas in Tibetan, I don't find that. In Tibetan, they don't care so much. In Tibetan, they may use the same word in so many different contexts. And then it is up to the translator to put it into context. In that sense, I do agree completely with what Geshe Thupten says, that we have to pay a lot of attention to the genre and also, of course, not to be dogmatic. I think that is something that as Buddhists we should never be dogmatic in any case, but in case of translation, even more so. Now, suppose we take one word which is used, I usually translate, except when I'm with His Holiness, and of course sometimes he likes to become quite into logic and and explain things in a very logical way, which is when it really is most difficult for me. I usually translate mostly contemplative, Mahamudra and Dzogchen, basically. And then you find, for instance, in Mahamudra, you have certain terms that they use it's almost like in such a free way. You have the word Trempa, for instance. Trempa is smriti in Sanskrit. It means, usually it's translated as mindfulness. But then you have the 4 yogas of Mahamudra, which lead you from ordinary being to complete enlightenment. And the word Trempa is used in the 4 yogas of Mahamudra. And it does not mean exactly the same thing. When you start, it's like, it's called Tsucheki Trempa, means Trempa with effort. And then in simplicity, the second yoga is effortless Trempa. And then it's in Rochik, which means one taste is when completely mind and phenomena have become inseparable. Again, they use Trempa, but they say perfect Trempa. And finally, in Gomme, they say the Trencho Gyelpo, which is the king, the supreme king, Trempa. Now, Trempa usually is translated as mindfulness. If we don't use like a meaning translation and we go by word translation, then we are really we are really translating something that does not represent how the meaning goes in the Tibetan. And when you're reading the Tibetan and you're translating, for instance, a guidance manual, they don't say at each point, this is perfect Trempa and this is supreme Trempa and so forth. They just use Trempa. But if you take it out of context, and you put mindfulness, maybe what the author says is that you rest in the nature of mind, which is very different than to say you rest in mindfulness or mindfulness associated with shamatha, for instance. So therefore, I do think that because of that restriction of our language, which is very precise and we need to be precise and so forth, then in the translation, we have to probably do more meaning translation than word-to-word translation, in the sense that we have to keep to the context and translate as fast or as close as possible what the instruction is at that point. Otherwise, we might make big mistakes just for the sake of only having that principle of translating one word in a specific way. That is one of the difficulties.
I should say that we should probably keep, if we want to have a conversation, then maybe we should try to keep these remarks to about less than 10 minutes. So.
Yeah, that means to say I'm ready.
Soon.
No, and then, well, I think that's as much as I wanted to say. You all know, it was easier for Tibetans somehow, because once a word was chosen, then there was a king's decree that said that that word was going to be used always. Like if you said klesha, then it's nyomong, and then finished. And everybody had to use nyomong. And then we wouldn't have to face the problems that Jeffrey mentions with 19 ways of calling klesha. So, but anyhow, that's the way. I think there's no authority nowadays that will make us all use exactly the same terms. It would be extremely difficult to find that among all translators, to adopt the same term for each word and then settle for it. So we live with it and we try to do our best. And in that way, of course, we will have many mistakes, but it's the only way that the teachings can come from the source to our different languages. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah?
So as you can, is this on? Can you hear?
No, it's not.
Try tapping it.
Here, you see this one.
That better? Yes. I think you can see from the presentations how many issues there are. There really, you wouldn't believe it if we went into all the details of so many, and so much so that if somebody asks, there's no time for theory, really. If somebody asks me about the art of translation, I mostly think of whether I should use a semicolon or an em dash, but I've been trying to think for this of some kind of broader categories, and I think you get the idea of the amount of detail that's involved. Two qualities that one might say are very important. One is accuracy, and another is beauty. And you would say, well, maybe accuracy is the primary one, the most important. But then, if something is not beautiful or inspiring, no one's going to read it, and it's not going to be anyway matter if it's accurate or not. So it's hard to say of those two. And then what makes something beautiful, and Geshe Thupten talked about the poetry. I think it's important in somewhat depending on the genre and subject matter. And certainly, as Gerardo mentioned, not boring. And because, I was thinking, how especially Tibetan Buddhism and then Vajrayana, which is the kind of main thing, is so many things that are kept secret, and one of the reasons things are kept secret is so that it doesn't scare people. Supposedly Vajrayana is scary things, and they're going to think bad things about the Dharma if they find out, and so we have to train people and initiate people and so forth. And I was sort of thinking maybe the big secrets should be the really boring stuff, like the, Prasangika Svatantrika debate or something. That could be the big secret, that you have to prepare people, sort of for mind-numbing tedium, and then give them empowerment so they can deal with it. But anyway, of course I'm being facetious, but anything can be boring if somebody doesn't understand it. No matter what. Even Tantra, one face, two hands, right hand holds a curved knife, left hand holds a couple, that's boring too if people don't understand what's going on. So there's a number of things as a translator to do in addition to trying to just make the language inspiring and beautiful and still accurate. And one thing is to give it context, and then you get the being bogged down, of course, a little bit with long introductions and footnotes and so on, but that gives it context for us. And another, I think, is to be in touch with the culture that you're translating into, and I completely agree that it's if you really have a mastery of the language you're translating into, it's important. And thank you for Geshe-la for saying that the English language is adequate. It's an incredibly rich language. You don't need to feel, like we're inadequate somehow. It's just a matter of using it correctly and well and beautifully. And then I want to add, if I dare, that particularly in practice genre or even theory of Vajrayana, that I think, maybe this is going out on a limb, but I really think people should be sort of practicing what they're translating, and or something like it. And I don't mean that someone has to have some realization or something, because that's like very hard to pinpoint. But particularly in tantric practice, which is primarily ritual is repetition. If you haven't repeated those practices a lot, actually, I don't think it's quite all that possible. And that to really do that well, I've noticed that myself. If I don't have any familiarity with the lineage, of the practices of lineage, and I'm trying to translate it, it's really, I'm just guessing. Really, I feel like I'm just guessing, even if I have very good informants. And so that, and those three things I'm going to say, great learning, practice if possible, and being in touch with a culture that you translate into if you want it to not be boring. And that way, if we can hope that you don't scare people away at the same time as not misleading them. Two things at once between accuracy and beauty. And yeah, that's really all I want to I do want to really thank the organizers of the conference, and especially, this is a great honor of people that I hardly dare call my colleagues to be on this panel. I also would like to thank the Tzadra Foundation for supporting my work, and in a rare appearance, the founder of the Tzadra Foundation, Eric Hollenbell, who I'm sure I've embarrassed. In
Thank you.
more ways than one.
Thank you, Sarah.
I guess I'm a bit of an odd duck here. Is this on?
Yep.
Being in publishing, a publisher. And oddly enough, Jose gave me a promotion by calling me an editor-in-chief. I wish I were editing and dealing with the texts in the books on a day-to-day basis, but in fact, I'm sort of corporate Buddhist. I'm the publisher and president and CEO, and sometimes I wish I were the editor. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, I know what I can contribute to this, but it would be, and it may interest you, but what I deal with on a day-to-day basis is kind of the enterprise of publishing and what's happening in that. Wisdom is deeply embedded in this whole enterprise of Buddhism and the Dharma, and I think most of you are fairly familiar with what we do. I took issue with saying that Svatantrika Prasangika is scary because we published a book with that exact title. What difference does a difference make? What is it? What difference does a difference make?
Yeah.
Sarah McClintock and George Dreyfus. So, and I'm very happy to be involved. I was honored and thrilled that Thupten Jinpa came to Wisdom, having appreciated the work that we did in translating the Nikayas with Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's the leading Pali scholar. In fact, the Pali Text Society that he cited licenses our translations, repackages them, and provides them to their membership. And Jinpa's not a good enough promoter, self-promoter, and marketer, but there's a catalog of, some of these are floating around outside if you want to see the 32 volumes that will be ultimately a part of the Library of Tibetan Classics. I think we're releasing number 8 coming up this fall.
Actually, a large part of that is being funded by Tzadra. Thank you.
So, just a couple of comments about publishing. I mean, there's this whole process going on. You're seeing it. You may be reading about it. Of this kind of what the technology is doing to it, and this kind of disintermediation, to use a multiple syllable word, Jeffrey. And all of that's a challenge. So the challenge to a publisher is, how do you remain relevant? How do you add value in that chain of delivery from text translation to audience? So that's kind of the challenge that we have, and I just made a couple of notes. Part of it's the selection, the juried selection, if you will. With Jinpa, it's a defined series of texts that he, and along with a number of other senior people in the traditions, have defined. With the studies in India and Tibetan Buddhism, it's Jose and Tom Tillemans before him bringing those works to our attention and kind of being the jury on them, if they should see the light of day. We also have a Classics in Indian Buddhism series that's been launched with also an editorial advisory board of sort of a next generation level of scholar, if you will, in terms of age. And that's the Mahayana text from the Sanskrit primarily, targeting that. So there's that. Then there's the editing, the quality of the editing. Jeffrey mentioned his editor at Atria, I guess, and Jinpa. It works with the guy whose job I wish I had, who's David Kittelstrom at Wisdom, who's been doing this for 16 years, starting in the shipping room. Nice Carleton College graduate who I say to people, he's among the top 3 editors dealing with this material. And I don't know who the other 2 are. He's various and sundry organizations and projects have been trying to poach him, but I keep holding them at bay. Actually, I mentioned that I was going to be here to him and said, did he have any thoughts? And of course, I lost what I had. Is there a little white piece of paper?
There.
It wouldn't be fair not to share. So he's just echoing a little bit what Sarah said. He said, he gave me kind of the hallmarks of a good translation, pointing out that it is competitive. It's a competitive environment out there right now for translations, and that is important to be of a high quality. And his hallmarks, his four hallmarks were scholarly rigor, literary grace, which basically you were addressing, a genuine feel for the Dharma, and that's kind of a question that Jinpa was touching on that would have been my question to the translators, kind of what level of realization do you in fact have to have in order to communicate what in fact is the original text is a translation really of someone's insight. So, and then the fourth thing he said was a sensitivity for the modern audience. Again, having literary grace and a style that actually communicates. And just ironically, he was sitting there editing because he's based in California and I'm in Boston area. And he wrote, so this is too much trouble for an editor. This is what a sentence he was dealing on from a translation. Its substantial continuum of similar type links with its results. To which he then put, what? So he takes that and turns it into these beautiful volumes that. I guess it's probably enough time for me, but Wisdom is thrilled to be a part of this enterprise, and.
Thank you, Tim.
Hello, everybody. Are you here? So it's a great honor to be here, sitting amongst great agents of translations that have really made mark in the world of Buddhism, in transmitting it into the new world and making sense. Not just sense, but even affecting the lives of individuals in a positive way. So I feel very honored to be sitting here as part of the panel, yet not so feeling competent enough. Yet at the same time, I think I have a few points to make. It cannot be by accident that we had 2 speakers in Jeffrey, Hopkins, and Thupten Jinpa, who, in my eyes, represent 2 translation schools, if you will, or 2 trends of translation that I have come across. And both of them have valid grounding, have their own uses, yet in different fields. That's how I would look at it. Because I remember my days in school at the dialectics, and then later in Depung, where I would be called upon to do translations. And their works of Jeffrey's has been very, very helpful. And I have seen that happen with Western students of Tibetan Buddhism studying with us, how his word-to-word translation, etymological translation, really helped them not just understand the content, but even what you call strengthen and empower them in understanding more. So for a student of Tibetan Buddhism trying to eventually turn to Tibetan and then solidify their understanding, Jeffrey's word-to-word translation, not that his works all are just exclusively word-to-word etymological, they are wonderful, fluent transmission of the teachings in his own original works, but when he translates, that's very typical of Jeffrey, to do word-to-word etymological translation, which are very, very empowering and enriching to the students, no matter Tibetan or Westerner, but trying eventually to seep into Tibetan texts and study and build the ground. For them, this is a must and very valuable tool. So when we speak of translation, basically what we are doing is we are transmitting. So transmitting we do through translation, but then it depends on who we are transmitting it, that the quality of the translation will be, quality or rather the nature of translation will be determined. So if we are transmitting the content of the Dharma to students who are geared towards eventually immersing themselves into studying Tibetan Buddhism through Tibetan on the basis of Tibetan texts, then Jeffrey's typical work of word-to-word lexical translation, etymological translation is wonderful and valuable. Invaluably valuable, if I may say so, just indulging a little bit. But then when it comes to transmitting the Dharma to the general audience, then it needs to be done a little differently. It has to be semantic. It has to be meaning-based. Their flexibility has to be allowed in terms of choosing different words for the same thing. So this distinction we have to make. And we have to mark on the very cover of the text that, yes, this is meant for those who are eventually immersing themselves into the Dharma through Tibetan language, whereas when it is meant for general people who are looking for instant deciphering of the meaning, then we cannot allow or have word-to-word etymological translation. That would be making it sound weird and making it sound kind of something else is going on, doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe something else is going on, nothing is of value there to learn from. And this usually happens when, say, translating philosophical topics, Madhyamika text topics, when that is meant for general readers. Then we have to have the sensibility of the target language in terms of how philosophy is treated there, in what context it is treated there. And I saw this very clearly in Thupten Jembala's book form thesis. I heard that earlier it was a little bit different version, but then now the book form thesis called Reality, whatnot, that reads like a Western philosophy, yet you get the transmission of the Western Tibetan Buddhist philosophy in a very understandable, comprehensible, yet at the same time very accommodative way. That's what we need to be keeping in our mind when we do the translation, keeping in mind what target audience it is meant for. This is very, very important. So I may come up with some examples, but I don't think this is the right time here. But I think I have already made my point. Because sometimes the word-to-word translation would mean very different to a general casual reader. May I give you an example?
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry, I can't. Just a light one, not so light. Take the case of form. See, in Western philosophy, form and substance, form versus substance, means very different. than form as used for Sukh. I had difficulty. I have just recently translated. Most of my translation works have been from English to Tibetan, because I have this sensibility that, as Thupten Jinpa very clearly mentioned, and everybody on the panel here agreed, that when we are translating something into the target language, it needs to be finally handled by a very authoritative person in the target language. It possibly and preferably it should be the native person in that language, or else it should be someone who has strong authority on that language. That's very clear. Otherwise, form and substance. If we were to use form Sukh, then substance would be Sukh. So there wouldn't be any difference in Tibetan, form and substance, whereas form in Tibetan would be Gopa, Godik, or Chagib. I had difficulty. Yeah. So I faced that difficulty. That's how I am able to speak of it. Because at one point I even tried Ngo Yishe La Nama Nangche. Ngo Yishe La Nama Nangche. This is taken straight from Tibetan tantric rituals, where it says Ngo Yishe La Nama Nangche. Ngo means, that is, here, Ngo here is the substance. Number is the form. But then if I were to use that, borrow that same thing into translation, that wouldn't make much sense. Because Ngo itself is almost sounding like being the form. Mm-hmm. So I had to kind of really figure out. So the translation of form for Sukh was very misleading for many people, particularly for the casual English, a right away comprehensible reading seeker people. But yet at the same time, for others who were kind of reading that and using that as a tool to kind of immerse themselves into Tibetan-based translations, then that was very helpful in kind of making a differentiation and kind of really then fitting very well with form realm, formless realm. It just falls in very naturally. So that's one example. Do you want another? Maybe. There's not much time. I have a list here. I'm not going to go. Well, I have made my point. Now, another thing is, translation is very interesting. It is a training, practice of its own. Practice on mirroring your ego, your ego. Yes, let me, before I forget, let me tell you. In Tibet, all the translations have been a teamwork. That speaks perfectly of the need of rendering a perfect, authentic translation. You always have a team of the native language speaker and the target language speaker. So when it is rendered into the target language, finally it falls into the hand of the native component of the team, who kind of has the upper hand in deciding what needs to be finalized. But in terms of getting the grasp of it, it's in the hands of the native people. So that works perfectly. And I have seen that in my own current work in translating science texts into Tibetan. While even working with Tibetan also, someone who has a better grasp of English would first make the sense. And then someone who has a better grasp of Tibetan would then finally come up with different options. And then between the two of you, you decide which sounds better. And in a way, what I was saying is, that translation is interesting in that it is itself a practice of mirroring where your ego lies. Sometimes you come up with a word and somebody criticizes you, you tend to think like, oh, he's criticizing my word. Whereas he's helping you to improve your work. But we tend to attach I, my with that, and that's very interesting. That itself is a great aspect of translation. And I've seen this so often. Now, so often that now I catch myself right away. So that fun part is almost lost. And then in terms of interpreting, I've always tried this. No matter how much you spill that you know the content of it, I always make sure that I read through the text on which the teaching is being given. And then mark all the words that you think that you might stumble on. So make a list of that. And if possible, run through that 2-3 times so that you have it off your hand. of your head. Or else you have the list ready so that you could just straightly stare at it and then deliver that. So that's very helpful. And for translating technical terms, it is always helpful to have 2-3 options. For translating technical terms, I have seen that it's good to have a handy, kind of a handy handcraft cutout, what you call equivalents. But then have 2-3 options of it, so that would feed much better in different contexts. That's what very helpful. Otherwise, if you become too flexible and trying to kind of come up with so different words, then it would be very confusing to the reader as to what you are actually referring to. Particularly when translating science texts into Tibetan, I have been very insistent on kind of at least finalizing on few technical terms, and then give that in at the end glossary where you give all the options you have chosen, but not let that be an endless list. Otherwise, the readers would be confused of what you are actually referring to. So that's something you need to be, one needs to be caring for.
Geshe,
Yeah.
point sumato me sungar, but point sheet ngaza
I think I made my point. But one thing is always to check your translation with somebody else. You have translated it. Don't think that this is my translation. Nobody should touch it. Otherwise, the credit will be shared. Don't ever think of that, because that would be sacrificing a lot for your own vested interest. So that's why you always be open to let it be checked by somebody else. When they check it, they wouldn't know the original text. So they would mainly be focusing on the readability of it. That has really helped in improving translation. With this, I thank you all.
Thank you. So I think I would like to, at this point, turn it over to the audience to give you opportunities to ask questions of our 2 keynote speakers or of any panelists. So please, ask away. Tony.
Tim, I would like to ask you to share with us the journey of wisdom in the sense of what it implies to have a Buddhist publishing house, and how is it that you make texts that are read by very few. How are you able to publish them and finance them and balance them with those that are much more productive economically? This is something of great interest, I think, and indispensable to make the art of translation available in general. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sounds like one of those questions you're supposed to pay the person for afterwards or something.
Business secrets. Yeah.
No, we are a nonprofit. I think people are aware of that. And we're self-sustaining. And a perfect example is out on that table, I just brought down two objects. One was Library of Tibetan Classics, which would have kind of that, it's deep into a part of our mission to provide this sort of thing. But you're right, it's a limited market for that sort of thing. Next to it on that table, you'll see a recent consumer catalog, and you'll see an array of books that we do. We publish ecumenically across the Buddhist spectrum, and you'll see a variety of books, and we, every season, we sort of have an array of generally a scholarly book from one of the series, and Jinpa's pressing me to make sure we have at least a couple of volumes, since hopefully both of us will still be alive when we finish the 32. And then the other books that, well, I jokingly called it in my office, TOOTH is like the acronym, but it's, we sit there and we say, well, maybe this book is our ticket out of this hellhole, because it's our shot at a big seller. Our all-time big seller is Mindfulness in Plain English, Bhante Gunaratna, which is over 250,000, seems to grow. Interest in mindfulness grows. It's a great book, and so it pays a lot of the bills. We do a little bit of fundraising, not very much, so I'm not really competing for funds with a lot of other worthy things. And Jinpa helps us out occasionally with his project. So you can become a subscriber to it also. Best deal
in the back.
I have a question. the author of the work that you are translating need to be dead or absent?
Being dead is oftentimes not enough. They have to be dead for a certain number of years before you're allowed to actually translate their works. So.
And not reincarnated.
And not reincarnated, right? Very important. So Buddhist translations have this special twist. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you. So, do they have to be dead? But you were going somewhere with this question.
The reason that I'm asking here is that I'm one of the producers of these science texts that are getting translated, and initially we, as a team, this is the neuroscience team, and our team was all prepared to have a barrage of constant questions about, okay, what is this and that, and then there were no questions. So then we started harassing the translators and saying, well, so don't you have questions? And we'll let you know if we have questions. And so we've gone away and we don't expect questions anymore. But I'm genuinely curious because so there's no motivation except actually the relationship between authors and translators, and it's actually most productive to just take the text and go with it.
Someone wants to, maybe I can, I think it's more of a question of the current situation in terms of the transmission of Tibetan tradition into English language. Since we're at a very early stage, we are nowhere near what the Pali Text Society have achieved. We have not been able to produce in English translation many of the texts that are recognized as classical and seminal for understanding the tradition. So the emphasis is more on producing these classical texts, which are, authors have long gone. But if, for example, it would make sense if the author is alive, if the translator is translating a text, and if the translator has access to the author, then of course it would make perfect sense to ask the author to get involved if the author is willing to do it, because there might be certain passages where certain points are made where the author has made a choice of saying that particular in a particular way as opposed to some other way. So author is definitely going to be very helpful as a resource. But in our case, as my mother-in-law puts it, Jinpa works on text by really, really dead people.
Does anybody else want to comment on the panel? Jeffrey?
Yeah. I almost always am seeking to consult with a scholar who's a specialist on that text. So if it's somebody long gone, I'm seeking to consult a Tibetan specialist who's alive now, and to ask. And then specifically, like with His Holiness, asking me to translate something that he has done. When we started, it was a short text, and I said, I'll do it if you will answer every question that I have. And he said, sure.
Yeah, I see a couple of hands. I just want to interject at this point. I mean, mostly we've been talking about translation from Tibetan into English, and Geshe Dadul mentioned at the end that there are now ongoing projects. I mean, we see texts that are science texts that are being translated into Tibetan, and now some philosophical works as well. What do you see? What do the two Geshe-las see as kind of the greatest desiderata in terms of the body of work that really needs to be translated into Tibetan from various Western languages, not only English?
No.
I mean, the emphasis on translating scientific premiers and textbooks is because of the urgency, because His Holiness is very keen to explore the possibility of really introducing scientific subjects as part of the curriculum in the monastic institutions, because he feels that, we have, sometimes people get the wrong impression that, Tibetans never study science. We have a whole generation of young Tibetans who grow up in secular schools, like my brother, he's a computer engineer. My sister went through the medical training. So we have a whole generation of young Tibetans whose command of science, modern science and mathematics, is comparable to any, society. But what we have lacked so far is a genuine encounter and engagement between the classical intellectual tradition and the modern scientific tradition and culture. And here, His Holiness has come to recognize that this can happen only if the scientific knowledge is brought into the monastic curriculum. Now, in order to do that, we cannot expect all the Tibetan monks to have the command of English, to be able to read these texts in the original. That's not how cultural encounters work. The Tibetan, when Dharma came to Tibet, not everybody learned Sanskrit. If that was the contingent, condition, then Dharma wouldn't be in Tibet. So you had to work through the translations, and that's why there is this urgency in working on the translations of key scientific kind of textbooks. But in the long run, I think there will be need to translate more and more of the key, not just science, but I would argue some of the key texts that have really shaped the Western European civilization, including going back to the Greeks. So I think this is probably a process that will happen, but at this point, I think Tibetans are too preoccupied by still trying to preserve what we have and revitalize it rather than bringing something new in. Science is a new recent development.
Damdula.
I have come across young Tibetans, some coming straight out of Tibet, expressing the need for enriching the Tibetan, enriching the volumes of Tibetan literature by bringing in best-selling texts across fields from Western languages. But in my own little service in this regard, by translating Professor J. Garfield's Western Idealism and its Critics into Tibetan, which will be due which will be out in the end of this year. I have seen that for the monastics who have been studying philosophical texts, it would be a great avenue for them to broaden, not just broaden, but even make them more, more capable, competent in transmitting their philosophical understanding through the windows of Western philosophy.
So let me ask you a question about this. Do you think, now that you've gone through the exercise of translating a Western philosophical text into Tibetan, do you think that the outcome of this is such that an educated Tibetan, say a monastically educated Tibetan, can pick this up and read it and understand the concepts without some sort of commentary?
Oh, in terms of understanding, I think it is within their reach. Given the level of philosophical exercise they need to do,
right,
even coming up to the Madhyamika, it's almost like no philosophical concept is almost out of it, except the way it is put, the way it is stretched, and the way it is expressed in a very rich way is the beauty that I have seen.
Yeah.
So I think that in terms of grasping, there wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, I guess I didn't mean so much from the level of the Tibetans, but more from the viewpoint of terminology. I'm just wondering whether it's like the situation that, for example, Jeffrey faced at the beginning when there was really a dearth of terminology and you had to kind of bootstrap this into existence by choosing certain terms.
Yeah.
And going back to what you were saying about, for example, choosing a semantic approach as opposed to a more literalist approach, and did you face those types of problems going from English into Tibetan?
Yes, actually in the field of philosophy, I was amazed how rich Tibetan language itself already is. So all it needs to take is just take one word here, another word here, and coin a new word. I've been very careful not to use the existing terms so that it wouldn't contribute to any confusion. I have been just kind of stretching it, or maybe making two words together, put together, and then make it sound different, so that it would immediately arouse the attention in them that this is definitely different. So, but in terms of conveying the philosophy, this hasn't been difficult at all. Understanding it hasn't been difficult at all. So I think, of course, first, for myself as a translator, I needed extended, hours of Skyping with the author in terms of really getting to the essence of it. When I understood it, and there was no difficulty in conveying it. And then in terms of others also, they would really love it and enrich it.
Okay, in the front.
I have a question about words that seem to have been used from the beginning when texts first started to be translated into English. And I have 6 here just off the top of my head that always trip me up when I'm giving classes. But let's just talk about one of them, and that's the word suffering as a translation for the Pali term dukkha. Every time this word comes up, I have to say, it's not really suffering, it really means unsatisfactory, and blah, blah, blah. So, is it possible to change that at this stage? Is it possible to, instead of having to go through this explanation every time I give a class, to be able to say, have a new word that means is closer to the word unsatisfactory or whatever dukkha means?
Well, there's the problem.
Is it possible to evolve at this point, or are we stuck with the terms that kind of have been accepted to the last?
You're really asking two separate questions. One has to do with the adequacy of this particular translation, and then the other question is the question of precedent, which we were talking a little bit about earlier. That is, what power does precedent have within translation, so that even if a translation term, if a term hasn't been translated 100% accurately, whether or not we're kind of stuck with it simply because of precedent, right? So does anyone want to tackle either or both of those questions?
I'll take one
Okay.
or two.
Yeah.
Which one of these work? Well, there's a couple of things in that. I mean, I think that it's actually depends on how ingrained it is. You don't want to confuse people by suddenly switching and everybody doesn't know what. But on the other hand, you can start a mass movement. You know, you can simply by using it. I've noticed that. I might even claim a few terms here and there that I just started using after I thought about words that just didn't seem right. You know, like great perfection, for instance. When you think about what perfection means, especially with Christian connotations, is the opposite of imperfection, and that basically perfection is leaving something out. That doesn't really match up, I don't think, with the meaning. That's just an example. And I noticed it started to be used in something more like great completion or completeness or whatever similar. So, and suffering is hard. I remember teaching a class using a Thich Nhat Hanh book, and he actually says the Buddha never spoke about suffering. And if anybody says the Buddha spoke about suffering, he's lying. So I had to go, well, okay, I get what he's doing, but, you know, we sort of think he did. I mean, talk about suffering, you know. I understand not to be too negative, but, you know, so I think if you go too far, and that might be one of them, I don't know, then you lose people. You lose people in a misconception and an inaccuracy, really. And that one might be one, even though I understand the skillfulness of it. At the same time, I feel like, you know, I had to do just as much blah, blah, blah to make up for it. So either, you know, both.
Yeah, Tim.
I was just pointing to...
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say one more thing to this question, which is that there's also such thing as footnotes, right? So translations can take advantage of this wonderful apparatus that we have in English, which also exists in Tibetan, but in Tibetan it's a little bit more intrusive because it's found within the the Tibetan text itself, whereas we have this wonderful device, which is, to put things. No, right? Brackets. This actually, when Tim was talking about the four things that David Kittelstrom hated, I thought one of them was going to be brackets, because but in any case, but footnotes is a wonderful invention, and there have been actually books written about footnotes. But
can I?
Yeah.
I mean, when we were developing the editorial guidelines, the house style of life of Tibetan artists, the question of terminology and whether or not to impose a uniform terminology and so on is very important. And I really resisted from having any kind of editorial imposition of uniformity of terminology, because I still feel that we are evolving. But having said that, one of the things that I do request all the translators is to really respect those conventions that have become very established. And professional wisdom for Western environment. Some people may hate the word wisdom, but in that context, professional wisdom has become established, and then trying to call it professional understanding causes more confusion. And in any case, I am a great believer in the Christian kind of idea. The meaning of the word is its use. Over time, it can come to acquire. Now, with respect to dukkha, now, yes, I take the point, but on the other hand, the pain that a dog experiences when you hit it with a stick is a dukkha, but you cannot call that unsatisfactoriness. That is a violation of English language. I mean, it just isn't. So now, given the choice, I would rather go with suffering. So then the truth of suffering has a nice ring about it. Truth of origin of suffering has a nice ring about it. So I think it's these kind of things that we have to negotiate. We have to negotiate various kind of contrasting obligations. But as much as possible, that's why I'm a great admirer of the Polytext Society kind of movement. And in fact, we have 2 volumes on Abhidharma in our series, and I asked the translators, I said, please do look at the translations from Abhidharma sources in the Theravada text. When it comes to 37 factors of path to enlightenment, all of these, there is no reason why someone translating from Pali should understand in one way, and someone translating from Tibetan, which is coming from Sanskrit, should understand in a different way. So in these kind of situations, and for example, in the case of philosophy, there's been a lot of work done directly from Indian sources into English. So those who are working on a philosophical text also need to take into account those kind of work. So that, just because we are translating from Tibetan doesn't mean that we have to move too far from the Sanskrit. Now, if we are talking about a commentary on a Sanskrit text by a Tibetan master, then the Tibetan reading of the terms is more important, even though the Tibetan master may have got it wrong. And then this was one of the arguments I had with one of the translators who is actually in our classics series. They are all Tibetan texts. And the translator was arguing that a particular Tibetan term for a particular Sanskrit term was wrong, and it should be translated in this way. But I said, look, you are not translating Sanskrit text here. You are translating from Tibetan sources, and you are translating this author's work, and if the author got it wrong, you have to get it wrong. You cannot correct the author. So these are the kind of things that we really need to,
Does that go for interpretation also? Oral interpretation?
But that I don't know. But with the text.
Rinpoche, up in the back.
Yeah, I've got a situation here, and this is basically what advice or suggestions you would give to produce translators, interpreters in places such as Mongolia or the Buddhist republics in Russia, where Buddhism flourished pre-communist era, and after communism destroyed everything, not just the books, but also all the clergy, all the scholars, and all the texts that remain. And after the post-Soviet Union, influence in Mongolia and Russia. And now we're at a time that we have those specialists and we're beginning from zero. So, for example, I think in Mongolia and Russia, it's been almost 20 years since we had that freedom of religion to practice our faith. But then again, in the last 20 years, we have failed to produce, experts in translating and interpretation. So, what advice or suggestion you would give, other than saying send more students to India to study?
Right. Yeah, and in fact, this may not be the most efficient way of gaining knowledge of Tibetan. I mean, it's a very thorough way of doing it, but if time is a factor, then it may not be the most thorough way. But others of you may have comments.
I'd make a comment, which is to just start. The way I started was that Gyume Khyentse Lingden was going into the temple to give a talk, and somebody had to translate for him. And I had no idea how to do it, but I was the person on the spot. I mean, there wasn't anybody else there. All the other, all the other American students Native American students had left. I was the only one left. There was no other choice. So I literally had to sit down and open my mouth and start. And that's how it started. There was no track. And I just began doing it. And of course, I'd done some study prior to that, but not a hell of a lot. And just start. And it's in a Mongolian community, and let me tell you, I have great feeling. And I was told a great deal about the utter and absolute slaughter under Stalin of the tulkus, monks, and so forth by the Stalinist regime, and put a great deal of focus on Mongolian writers in Tibetan. So I'm not speaking at all casually.
I would add one thing here, that the language instruction in Tibetan, for those who are not Tibetan language speakers, is notoriously, I think, inefficient compared to the way that of other language pedagogy of other East Asian languages, like Chinese and Japanese. I mean, a student at my university will go into a Chinese course and will come out at the end of a year being able to speak pidgin Chinese, and after 2 years can kind of go into the culture and manage fairly well. That's very unusual that happened in regard to Tibetan. And I think that is a kind of challenge that we face in the field, is to create that very high level of language pedagogy so that students can actually function in Tibetan in a relatively, short amount of time. And I think it's not something, it's something that has broad implications, not only in the West, but in other parts of Asia as well, wherever people want to pick up the Tibetan language. Any other last comments on the panel? I think we've reached our time limit, so. Okay, I want to thank all of you very much for a wonderful presentation. And also to thank the organizers of this conference for the tremendous amount of work that went into its preparation and execution. Thank you all.